Oh, off mute. I have to do it once a day. Thank you so much, Delana, and definitely want to say grateful to have Jess. I know how to, you know, hold politicians accountable, but I think what's really important here and kind of why we're gathered is really knowing what is their function beyond just election, beyond just what we see on the outside. What is the intention of this office? How does it work in the greater context? So before we get into that, we can go over just a couple of housekeeping items. If you would like to introduce yourself with the chat function, which I believe is open for folks, we'll find out here soon. You're welcome to put your name, pronouns, and where you are joining in from. And if you would like, one sentence or a couple of words about why you're here. Again, if you want to use the chat function to introduce yourself, where you're coming from, why you're here, you're welcome to do that. I believe it's open. You all will test and help us. And then a couple more housekeeping things. You all are automatically muted, but again, through the chat box and also through the question and answer function, you can reach out to us. And for questions, please use the Q&A dialog box. The other thing I will note is that this is being recorded, as you probably just saw as a pop-up, and we will send out the recording and any other follow-up materials through email after. And also, I do want to say that this is, I know that people are getting inundated with text messages from campaigns, and this is not a candidate event. This is really an educational event, or a training, rather. Again, in the vein of slowing down and understanding what do district attorneys do. We are a nonpartisan organization, but that doesn't mean that we aren't political. Policies are part of politics, and that's what we care about. We are here because of policy outcomes and how elections really shape, and the candidates while they're running really shape policy outcomes for the future. So that is our focus. And while we do candidate education and engagement, it's not about promoting the candidates or their personalities. It's about policies and the people in their jurisdictions. All right. So if you go to the next slide, Jess, so kind to do slides for me. So just to look ahead and wrap our minds around what's coming up, after this kind of introduction, setting further context, we'll pass it over to Jess, who will do really dig down and define district attorneys for us. And then we'll move into their impacts, and we'll also talk about kind of the Colorado scene, and then zoom down into Jefferson and Gilpin counties, which of course is a lot of you all. And so the goals for the presentation or for this training are to, one, actually understand in a substantive way what district attorneys do from the lens of criminal legal reform and civil liberties. And then we want to walk away with a clearer understanding of the actual criminal legal system, how it's structured, and then how it actually has effects on civil liberties issues, racism, and other social disparities, especially class. And this is where we're getting to the good stuff, because we're 30 odd days away from the election, right? So we want you to be able to leave feeling comfortable to talk about district attorneys in a substantive way with your family and friends. We all know that we're operating in an environment of mass misinformation. And so having these really clear facts will help us stay grounded, cut through the noise, and most importantly, not only help ourselves, but help our friends and family battle through the misinformation so we can exercise our rights with consent. And of course, this is an advocacy presentation, so this isn't just information to stay in your head. Our goal is that people will feel inspired, or at least enabled, if they would like, to get involved during this election and even beyond in our fight for government accountability, transparency, and criminal legal reform. Next slide, please. Okay, so we like to be explicit about the norms of this training, not to be patronizing, but just to recognize that we have folks from all walks of life, different backgrounds. You know, it's ACLU, so we have some maybe retired attorneys, or maybe some younger folks who are just newer to voting in general. So we encourage you to participate and ask questions along the way. Again, this is a training, so it's a learning environment. We have a decent size group as well. Be open-minded, of course, always important to name in a learning space. And especially the last one, respecting others' experiences and opinions. And again, this is it's an ACLU space where we are going to be very pro-criminal legal reform, pro-government transparency. So it's kind of the space we're in. And then we could go to the next slide, Jess, which passing it off to you, I believe.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Jen. All right, so to start off, let's do a little introduction here just to kind of set the stage of what we're talking about. So I'm going to read off a bit of statistics. Whoops. Wow. Okay, there we go. So, and it just wants to keep going. That's great. Okay, so first statistic. We have here 4.6% of Colorado's population is Black, and 21%, a little close to 22% of our population in the state is Hispanic. Yet, as early as April of 2020, our jails report that 12% of our inmates or prisoners are Black and 27% are Hispanic, so a bit of disparity there. Another statistic is there are approximately about 13,000 people in Colorado jails, and about more than half of them have not been convicted of a crime or are held there only because they cannot afford to pay bail for their release. Another statistic is that nationwide, about close to 12 million people misused opioids in 2016, and then in 2018, Colorado reported 543 opioid overdose deaths. And then in our last statistic, we have in a study that was conducted back this January, a little over 1,200 people were recorded to be homeless or houseless. So let me ask you this question, and you can throw it up in the chat, is which court actor has the most influence over these statistics? So you can go ahead and put in what you think that might be. Okay, I see DA. Someone said police officers, okay. DA. All right, so we have a DA. Y'all are so smart. Given from the topic of the session, I'm going to guess DA. And so yes, definitely the answer is district attorneys. I mean, certainly when it comes to police officers, you know, they're definitely a group where a lot of people will have their first introduction into the criminal legal system. But the hope is that, you know, by the end of this webinar, we will be able to show you why we believe the district attorney is probably one of the most influential court actors, or just in terms of actors in the criminal legal system, and basically why we believe, you know, it's so important to educate our members and our activists as to why this is so. So to lay a little bit of groundwork, you know, we've set the stage, you know, for what the most important role is. So let's, or at least most influential role. So let's go into it. What is a district attorney, for example? So let's start off with the exact position, the title, and the scope. The district attorney is a public official who is appointed or elected as the chief prosecutor to represent the state government in criminal cases within their own jurisdiction. So they can go by titles such as prosecuting attorney, and they really play this major role in determining the way that criminal cases are initiated and resolved, all the way from the charging decisions to sentencing. It's important to note that the district attorney is this legal entity, rather, that is responsible for presenting cases against the individual, initiating and directing investigations, and then again, guiding and offering sentencing recommendations. So essentially the DAs really can make choices every day that can determine which laws are enforced and against whom, and how much punishment they can really carry. So it's important to note that in Colorado, district attorneys are elected officials. If we leave here today knowing nothing else, we know that district attorneys are elected officials. They do have eligibility requirements under law to run for office. And those eligibility requirements are kind of really the same that we have for district judges. So they must, of course, be licensed to practice law in Colorado for 5 years. They have to be qualified to vote in the judicial district that they are representing at the time of the election, and they have to reside in the district throughout their term. District attorneys are limited to 2 consecutive terms of 4 years each. And that also, I think, is something that's really important to note, is that while a DA is an officer of the court, and we consider them like an attorney just like any other one in a court, the district attorney is not considered a judicial officer, or they're not really considered part of the judicial branch. Under Colorado law, they actually belong to the executive branch of our government. And that really has been clarified and solidified through state law. And so really you kind of see them more of as a law enforcement official, just like you would a police officer, or even like the Colorado Bureau of Investigations. A little tidbit that I think that is also really helpful to put this in context is that according to our reports, even though most district attorneys are elected officials, about 70% of district attorneys run unopposed for re-election. So if you are to look at our current election, a lot of DAs that are running for office are running unopposed, but here in JD1, y'all are really one of the few districts where you have more than one person running for office, which means that you have a lot of power in determining who actually gets to fill this office. So it's really important, I think, to note. So in Colorado, there are 22 judicial districts in Colorado, and each of these districts have their own district attorney's office. And so they oversee, of course, cases that are in state trial district courts. And again, these district courts are established under our Colorado Constitution. And the districts kind of encompass one or more of Colorado's 64 counties, but of course there's going to be some exceptions to the rule. So for example, Denver is the only district, and they represent District 2. They're the only district in Colorado that has a separate probate and juvenile court. And then outside of that, there are only 4 other counties that have their own judicial district, that being Pueblo County, Weld County, Boulder, and Mesa County. So important to also note is that the title of district attorney includes not only just the elected DA, but the prosecutors that are in that office as well. So that can be the assistant DA, that can be investigators, that is even included support staff. But just also note too that the state of Colorado only provides the salary for the elected district attorney, and then all the other staff positions are often taxpayer funded counties that are represented in each jurisdiction. So again, you know, this is really kind of where, you know, being able to vote for your DA becomes important, because then that DA is going to staff their office with who they want to staff with. And at the end of the day, you're going to be the one paying those costs. DAs also kind of have special victim units as well, and specialized units, and they can range from either homicide or domestic violence, white collar crime, narcotics, etc. So just to kind of give you a sense that the DA's office is more than just the DA that is elected, but a whole kind of ecosystem that runs. So now that we've given you some kind of background as to what a DA is and kind of how they're formed under Colorado law, let's talk a bit about the power of the DA and how they really play that role in determining criminal cases, again, from charging to sentencing. And excuse me for my child in the background playing. So I believe Adam Foss really says it best. And he says that prosecutors are the most powerful actors in the criminal justice system, or what we call criminal legal system. And that in most cases, it's not the judge, not the police, not the legislator, not the mayor, governor, or president can tell how to prosecute our case. And I think that this is really important because I think what it really shows is that even prosecutors know just how much power they wield in the courtroom and beyond. So again, we mentioned that the DA essentially has a lot of power to carry out the justice. Historically, DAs have wielded their power to pack our jails and prisons, interrupt the lives of defendants and their families, and can also really deepen racial disparities. And we'll show you how this works. Again, they can recommend freedom. They can recommend incarceration. They can recommend to dismiss a case altogether. So let's look at, these kind of 4 points in terms of how they wield their power and how, this really kind of shows up. And we'll start with the power to charge. So essentially, to charge someone is a formal accusation of an offense against a defendant, and is really kind of that first step of prosecution in the legal system. So in Colorado, the DA has the final say as to whether to charge or not charge. They have the responsibility, again, to gather evidence and prosecute against those accused. And they also have the power of the police to kind of help them gather that evidence for investigation. So even though like prosecutors, they have the burden of proving someone's guilt, they also have the power to hand over evidence that can exonerate a defendant. And this is what we call, like in the legal world, as exculpatory evidence. And so unfortunately, there's just too many common stories that we hear across the country where district attorneys withhold some of that essential information from the defense. And what ends up happening is that defendants end up getting saddled with having to work to gather evidence to secure their own freedom. So it's a really weird flip of what's really supposed to happen. And that can be really difficult, especially if you cannot afford a private attorney who can spend that time and that money to gather what they need to. Because, at the end of the day, public defenders, they're kind of really strapped when it comes to resources to have to do that extra step just to make sure that they get everything that they need in order to properly defend you in a case. If we look at the power to determine bail and pretrial detention. So for a bit of context, I'm sure as many of you know, bail is really this process of releasing a defendant from custody when their case is still pending in court. And so we know judges like to listen to what prosecutors have to say about a case, including whether or not bail should be set for a defendant, or whether that person should languish in a cage. And so although judges make the bail determinations, I think it's really important to know that it's usually rare when a judge to order bail for a defendant if the DA has no request. Many times what we see in our work is that DAs rely on cash bonds, which is basically this requirement that money be paid up front before a defendant is released, as really this way to keep people in custody until their trial date. Or they might request additional conditions to make it difficult for a person to remain out of jail, such as placing travel restrictions, ankle monitoring, drug testing. Often because DAs know that many people can't afford to secure their own freedom. And so these are really put as financial barriers as a way to keep people in jail. And I think, as we may be well aware, and we'll talk about it a bit in our webinar later on, is that the people who end up staying in the cages are disproportionately Black, they're Latinx, Indigenous, too poor to secure their release, or they may have a disability of some sort. And so overall, this system of pretrial detention really is designed to keep the folks that we want to keep in jail Even though a person has not legally been found guilty of a crime, we call them legally innocent, but they're still deprived of their freedom, and that's a problem. If we look at here the point of the power to plea bargain, so earlier we kind of, talked about, who has this kind of most influential role in the court. And I think we need to really kind of dispel this myth, so to speak, that a judge or a jury has the most power to exercise the fate over a criminal case. And the reason why we have to dispel that is because nearly 95% of cases that prosecutors decide to actually move forward in prosecution actually end up with a defendant pleading guilty, which means that people don't even reach a judge or a jury to make that decision before a person may already be kind of saddled with that criminal conviction. And why that is because DAs use plea bargaining to kind of leverage guilty pleas from defendants who don't want to run the risk of facing either a prolonged trial or a prolonged sentence if they're found guilty. Sometimes instead of calling it plea bargaining, we kind of call it plea extraction, so to speak. And so in order to avoid the possibility of a longer jail sentence, a defendant may take a deal to plead to a lesser offense in exchange for a more lenient sentence or even a dismissal of charges. And sometimes that can be whether they're innocent or not. And I think because of that, that really shifts the power to determine what's the best form of justice from a prosecutor or from a judge to a prosecutor, really without much oversight. People charged with mandatory minimum, so to speak, often plead to a sentence that a prosecutor wants versus what a judge determines best. And then I think it's also important for us to note that even though an overwhelming majority of criminal cases in the US are resolved through plea deals, there's actually few research that's been dedicated to actually look at the plea bargaining process, so to speak. And so for the research that has been done, what we can see is that plea extractions also fuel racial disparities that we see in the system. So for an example, Black defendants are less likely to receive any leniency in the plea bargaining process, even when they have a clear record. And that's again, because prosecutors can wield that kind of discretion in setting plea terms, and just like many of us, maybe, be bringing that implicit bias into the mix. And the last part we have here is the power to influence sentencing. So sentencing will determine the length of an individual's period of incarceration. That's essentially what sentencing is. So if you do find yourself in that very small, like 5% pool who decides to go all the way to trial, the prosecutor still has that power over the length of your sentence if a jury finds you guilty. And that's because during the sentencing phase, that judge's decision making is again really heavily influenced by the recommendations of the DA, and often not will approve whatever sentence the DA ends up recommending. So I know that's a lot and a bit of a mouthful, but again, they wield a lot of power. So it's also important to note that even though judges, as we just discussed, have the discretion to do these things, to charge more, to set high bail and bond, they also have the discretion to choose freedom and to choose alternatives rather than add to the mass incarceration problem. So diversion programs, for example, instead of revoking bail or sentencing folks to a lengthy jail stay, DAs can recommend to court that people be released on what's called a personal recognizance bond, or PR bond, so to speak. And this is basically allowing defendants to be released without having to buy their freedom or put cash up. And instead, they can attend diversion programs to receive life-saving services, whether that's rehabilitation or to allow them to work while they're away, rather than, again, languish in jail. That way, a person can see their criminal charges dropped when they successfully complete the program, and then they don't become saddled with this lifelong criminal conviction. I think it's important to note that diversion programs can be very impactful in terms of helping decarceration, but what we do see is that they are vastly underutilized. So we also need to make sure that programs like diversion programs or rehabilitation programs are also fairly administered, that they don't become like these cash cow generators for the court. And then we need to make sure that these programs are eligible to all people, regardless of a defendant's ability to pay. And that we need to also make sure that DAs are not more willing to offer it to white defendants than they are to Black, Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous communities. The district attorney also has the power to dismiss a case altogether. And why would they do that? Again, DAs really have this power in terms of sentencing. And ultimately, it really is up to a DA to determine what is worth the taxpayer's dime in terms of which cases to pursue or not. And so because DAs are really the starting point for plea negotiations and deciding what initial charges to file, they're also really also empowered to reduce charges to less serious ones, and to really kind of look at some of these cases and really think, does it make sense to spend taxpayers' dollars housing someone in jail versus, again, going through a diversion program or dismissing it altogether? And then last but not least, championing policy for systems change. So instead of increasing their power within the district attorney office, DAs really can lobby for change outside of the scope of their work, helping to champion sentencing reductions, more humane probation, and really kind of shifting those resources to public defenders to ensure that everybody, regardless of how much money you have, can afford a good defense and have a fair fight against a criminal conviction. So now that we have that piece, I think it's important to kind of say, well, let's look at these powers and how does it impact us in the community? You know, we definitely think that these things impact a person who is going through the system, but it can also really impact those around that person in the community at large. So if we go back, we can look at, again, some of the statistics that we put up beforehand when it comes to racial disparities, when it comes to pretrial, when it comes to mental health needs and homelessness. So if we were to look at the racial disparities, and again, that statistic of the 4.6% of our population being Black, 21.8% Hispanic, but the disparities of what we see in jails is that there's a overrepresentation. Well, the DA really has the power, as we had kind of looked at beforehand, and in affecting, you know, these decisions. Are, you know, is a DA just charging and not really kind of looking at who's coming through the door and whether or not they're coming through the door for the right reasons? Or do they have the power to say, hey, we're dismissing it, these kind of cases for group X, you know, why is there a disparity there? The power to determine bail and pretrial detention. I'm sure many of us know that there is this intertwine between a race and wealth gap, and are certain communities less likely to afford their bail than other more affluent ones? And so can a DA choose, you know, high bail versus really looking at whether or not a person has connections in the community, whether they truly are a risk to the community, to instead set PR bonds. Again, the power to negotiate plea bargains, as I was just mentioning the statistic that even a Black person who has a clean record seems to have a harder time to be able to get a plea bargaining deal than other groups, and how's a DA impacting that? And again, you know, making sure that diversion programs are being used equitably, across the board in order to, again, making sure that everyone has a fair shot of redemption, so to speak. And to, again, to dig deeper into the socioeconomic disparities, again, 13,000 people in Colorado jails, and yet more than 50% of them have not been convicted of a crime and are only held there because they cannot afford to pay the bail money. So if you are considered legally innocent, why else would you be languishing in jail between the time of arrest until your trial date? It's usually because there's a difficult time to pay that high bail. So again, using the DA, using that power to determine whether to set a bail that they know a person cannot meet for a traffic infraction versus, you know, looking and seeing, is it better suited that we give a person a PR bond so they can continue to work and promise to come back to jail or come back to court, excuse me, at a later date. And again, substance use disorder. I think that given the rise that we see in opioid use, I think that probably a lot of us know somebody, whether it be a loved one or a neighbor, that might be impacted by opioid addiction. And so if this was your family, would you much rather them get the help that they need versus languishing in a jail that is not designed to be a health center, is not designed to be a rehabilitation center? And how can a DA, you know, show that compassion to, instead of, you know, sentencing them and throwing away the key, giving them a chance to get healthy again? So again, like, really, if this is impacting the community, impacting your life personally, how would you want a DA to treat the folks that you know who might be experiencing misuse of opioids or versus opioid deaths? And then, you know, we have the statistic of homelessness. So, you know, again, about, you know, close to 9,800 people incarcerated in 57 jails, and about 1,200 of those were homeless. And so again, these are we criminalizing poverty? Are we criminalizing people for a place to rest when they have no place to rest? And like, whether or not we are charging people for just their condition of being poor or being houseless, or are we, say, using programs to get them housing, to get them, you know, programs, really actually helping people versus throwing them in cages? And again, bail. Why set $1,000 bail for someone you know may only have $1 in their pocket? Really just thinking about, like, what is the best use of our resources as a community. I do want to note, you know, there are also some other aspects of a DA's position that does impact things in our community. Of course, a lot of conversation is gone around about police brutality and the accountability that comes from it. And so DAs really, again, they can have that power to treat everyone fair against the law, and against the law, including those who break the law, including police officers, and can choose to investigate and charge if that is appropriate, or turn a blind eye and dismiss cases altogether. We have to also think about our undocumented neighbors and whether or not DAs are using a draconian system to overcharge for misdemeanors and therefore triggering deportation processes and breaking up families, or again, you know, looking at things in a more holistic approach, and instead of using the legal system.
All right. We're going to give it a second here for Jess to come back. She did explain to us before the webinar started that her power had went out, so she was on computer auxiliary power. Jen, would you like to join us on screen here?
Sure would. And this is actually really close to when I would take over. So, of course, Jess could time out a crisis like that. So I will just give me a second to everybody to share my screen for you. And I know there's a couple questions coming in. One pertaining to what about the judges and oh, there's Jeff. And how, I have a question. I'm just going to go ahead and take a question from now. Okay, I have a question.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay,
Yeah.
Jeff.
I lost connection a bit, but I actually was done. If you want to pull up the slides, I just wanted to finish up with the group about like other pieces in terms of youth and how the DAs can influence. But after that, I wanted to hand it off to you. So apologies for that disconnection.
No problem.
I just want to say something funny here. We've done 30 of these webinars in the last 2. This is 32. And then the last 2, we've had these kind of connection problems. We were not cursed until the end, so.
It's just the next crisis that we'll have will be AI revolting, but
Yeah.
and I'll start with Zoom, I think. Can you all see my screen? It's kind of wonky on my side.
You could, yeah, there you go.
All right, cool.
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, but you, that agenda is incorrect. All right, well, the spoiler here is that, or I'm just gonna kind of shift into looking at Colorado and why elections matter. And so most district attorneys, even though again, they're public office, and I am actually for the sake of my own internet going to turn off my video so you can have a second to catch up. Okay. This should help. Also giving everyone a chance to review. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so 70% of district attorneys' offices or district attorneys run unopposed for office. Yet we see over and over and over again in national polling and state polling that the vast majority of folks agree that they are for serious criminal legal reform, and particularly in areas of reducing jail populations, ending policies that criminalize poverty, for example, cash bail, which we'll talk about again here, and also giving our neighbors second chances, because as Jess was touching on, like, these are our neighbors, and when we're talking about criminal legal reform and district attorneys, we're also talking about something very local, which I think is important, because unlike if you're talking about the Attorney General William Barr, that's very far away. Of course, still impacts our lives, but our district attorneys and their prosecutorial powers affect our neighbors, our family, our friends in ways that, like, you'll notice at King Soopers, or you'll notice walking down the street. Again, so we have 70% of district attorneys running unopposed, and then we have a vast majority of voters supporting criminal legal reform. So that's kind of the intention of why we're here, why we do this work, and why it's so important to start with education. Because to fill that gap, we first have to understand what do district attorneys do, and then we can understand how we can cast an informed vote. And so let's talk about Colorado here. Like, all the things that Jess just named, all the issue areas that take from the criminal legal to the social and real, policy to the people, like how district attorneys affect youth, how they affect our immigrant communities. All of those things are Colorado issues. In Colorado, it seems when we're looking at a national level, and it's also true, there's so much division, right? Like there's, especially when we talk about reform issues. But actually Colorado, if you look at our policy records here, criminal legal reform policies and legislation are passed and sponsored bipartisan, right? So it's kind of a misnomer to say that like this is a super partisan divisive issue, because in Colorado, if we look at the records, especially for legislation that ACLU has been a part of, almost every piece of ACLU sponsored, or not sponsored, supported active legislation that we're really excited about has bipartisan sponsors. When we look at Senate Bill 217, which is the historic police reform bill that we passed here in Colorado this summer in the wake of the demonstration sparked by George Floyd's death, we were one of the only states, if not maybe still the only state, that passed the ending of qualified immunity and passed all of these strong and important reforms, not enough, but important starts to reform. And that was passed with bipartisan support. And that's just really important to remember that Colorado, yes, we have a spectrum of people, but even for whether you're left or right, you agree that the criminal legal system is too large and we could better use those resources. So that's just important context, again, to preparing us for the environment of misinformation and division and things getting just partisan really quickly. Okay, so zooming down to Judicial District 1, which is all of you. This is a very boring slide, but I'll talk through it. So Judicial District 1 is one of, as Jess had pointed out, 22 judicial districts in Colorado. And what makes it the most unique here is it's one of only a literal handful of judicial districts with a contested district attorney race. So that's something very, again, we go back to that 70% statistic, running unopposed. You are in the lucky minority here. So for Jefferson County, just to review, although you'll probably know this because you live there, some major municipalities are Lakewood and Golden. And I know that there are lots and lots of municipalities in Jefferson, so I mean no harm by not naming all of them. And then in Gilpin, same thing, same disclaimer, but we have Blackhawk and Central City. And some things we've seen, like looking at Jefferson County, is huge increases in housing costs. I'm sure that folks who have lived there or are living there now have seen that, especially if you've lived there for a while. Feel free to share in the chat if that has been your experience. And in Gilpin County, we know that it is a major food desert with few to little grocery stores. So what I'm doing here is queuing up like, hey, where are these counties at in terms of issues that we know can lead to interaction with the criminal legal system? Because by knowing that kind of context, we can also know how we can advocate for policies that will help rehabilitate folks rather than criminalize, which benefits our whole communities. So again, looking at Jefferson and Gilpin, Jefferson seeing a 50% rise in cost of living from between the year of 2006 and 2016. Gilpin, we have seen even rises in living costs and less access, especially to fresh foods. Other issues that we're seeing in these counties, especially in Jefferson, is an increase in the amount of folks who are ending up in the ER for opioid overdoses and abuse. And we're also seeing a nationwide trend of increases in opioid substance misuse in response to the impacts of the pandemic. In both of these counties, which we found very interesting, there's also a large spike in mental health needs. For example, in Jefferson County, between 2017 and 2019, we saw almost a 10% increase in folks who were surveyed saying that they needed mental health care access. In Gilpin, it's Bleecker, there's about 1,400 Gilpin residents per one mental health provider. Again, why are we saying all of this? Because it's just so helpfully laid out, is that we know that the folks that are overcrowding jails and costing taxpayers so much money is because of social issues or just living issues like costs of housing and addiction. And so Jefferson County, for all of you voters or residents, I'm sure that you are used to getting inundated more than most folks with lots of political mail. That is because Jefferson County is often said to be the bellwether for the rest of the state in terms of politics. So that's a convoluted way of saying that there is a lot of opportunity for, that there's a lot of opportunity to lead the state. And I think this is really important because not only are we are you all one of the few judicial districts that has an opportunity to make a state, but these counties really can help lead the state. Jefferson is one of the most populous and growing counties, and district attorneys it's really important that we have them signed on to these platforms so that when they are working with their fellow district attorneys throughout the state, because they're all part of an association and they work together and agreeing on policies, that there are more pro-reform district attorneys that are able to represent in the statewide level. And again, we want to be proactive in our COVID recovery. That's another reason why we're outlining those statistics, right? We all know that we are bracing ourselves for a lot of impacts from the pandemic. And like so many people have been saying, the pandemic has not created disparities, but made them impossible to look away from. And so again, being proactive rather than just reactive and anticipating these needs of our community members. Okay, and I'll go to the next slide. So that brings us to a call to action. There are several ways that you all can take action and get further involved. One, although you're kind of already here, so I'm guessing that you care about district attorney work. So we're encouraging folks to take a district attorney accountability pledge. And then, of course, this is everywhere, is to make sure that you are registered or updated your mailing address on your registration. You can go to govotecolorado.com, which is actually the Secretary of State's website. And please ask away any questions about how to cast your ballot or how to get registered to vote. And then these last two are coming up in October. So right now we're still educating folks on what the heck does a district attorney do. But as we get we're so close to October, we will start shifting our attention to really looking at the ballot and making sure that folks have resources to fill out their ballots and feel empowered and informed. And so part of that is we are coming out with a voter guide, which will have the ballots that we are endorsing or opposing. And then it will also have educational, online educational materials about the district attorney. So if you're a voter, like let's say your friend, your neighbor, is like, oh, yo, and we all have these friends, it's most of mine. Hey, how should I vote on this? What does this mean? It's like a day before the election. This voting guide resource can help you either share it with them or refresh yourself on like, oh, here are the 3 or 4 sentences that are really important to know about a district attorney. And here's a link to the ACLU questionnaire. ACLU asked these candidates questions about civil rights and civil liberties policies. So that's the voter guide. It's a very great resource. Again, a lot of folks who join these types of calls are the more active people. So it's important that you have these resources so you can share with your friends who aren't really going to engage till far later in the cycle. In that same vein, the second thing that we want you to look out for in October, right around the corner here, is to organize and host your own DA training. So if you have people, especially in Jefferson and Gilpin counties, who would be interested in this district attorney work, interested in this criminal legal work and taking a deeper dive, please email voting at aclu-co.org. It's on your screen and we can put it in the chat. and we're happy to work with you directly to help you organize, because it's all virtual, a training or a ballot guide party. So for more details on that, if you want to go the furthest level, if you're super passionate, please reach out. We're happy to talk to you about all of that good stuff. Which leaves us with time for Q&A. All right.
All right. Do you want me to read these off, or are you okay to read them yourself?
You can read them.
I didn't quite get that.
I think we could read them.
Okay, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, so this question from Andrew is about judges. Okay, so let's go. I have a question. It's both about Election and Democracy Institute that never, or democratic institutions that never work for judges or attorneys. Every time we see on the ballot a list of judges and ask if we want them to stay or leave, 99.9% of people do not know that judge, and how can we make that decision? Can we use trial instead of an appeal court, and can we evaluate the judge? And so this question is getting around, of course, how can we be informed on judges? I will send a resource in the chat and in the follow-up. This is a big education gap. We get these questions all the time, and we refer folks to their judge evaluations that the state puts out, which are made public. So you can go find the judge that's on your ballot and look at the evaluation. And I can also share in our follow-up some national organizations that do court accountability work. But that is, I'm with you. There needs to be some sort of gap, some education to fill that gap. Jess, do you have anything else to say?
No, I was about to say, like, I know that there are usually like some short evaluations, particularly if folks haven't gotten their blue book yet, there might be some information there. But yeah, I think we could definitely send a resource. I mean, again, you know, as I was kind of mentioning kind of in the slides before, like having judges is kind of one thing, but remember 95% of cases don't even make it before a judge. And so I think, again, it's kind of really important to, you know, I think definitely there is that education gap, but I think it just kind of shows, again, just how much influence the DA has if only 5% of people or the cases that we see that are going before a judge only actually represent 5%. Of the cases that are out there. And that's not by accident, that's by design, because if you had 100% of cases go all the way before a judge and the jury, the system would collapse, is, you know, what a lot of people say. But I think we could find some resources for folks on how they can get more information about their judge if they want to go into the election more informed about that. It's a great question.
Awesome. And Allison just said in the chat, I have the blue book in front of me and the judicial performance evaluations are in there. And actually, Jess, I think you were kind of starting to touch on it, and like the system isn't designed to see all cases. But Kirk is asking, most legal decisions are based on statutes and legal precedent. So why can't, oh, I'm sorry, I actually wanted to, that's the wrong question I'm reading. This question was in the chat earlier, but it's what are the incentives for district attorneys to put people in jail? Like why would they want to do that?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know necessarily if I have an answer to that because I'm not a prosecutor and I can't look inside the mind of why prosecutors send folks to jail. But I mean, I guess maybe I say, you know, as a voter, if I was to look at like, you know, a lot of these like ads, like there's the tough on crime. And I think that, you know, as a culture, you know, we want, you know, systems that seem to punish than to actually give people a second chance. So I can't say, you know, as to what the real reason is, but I think that there is a culture that we do have where it seems like the tougher we are on crime, the better we are at being able to do other things. And I think what we want to show people is that that's not always the case.
Yes. Yeah, and I would, in the same vein, say that when most voters skip this race, the people that are in the ear of the district attorney might be are the police unions, or it's like this revolving door of people who come from, a tough on crime, or just this a law enforcement background with law enforcement values that might be different in ways than the community's values. So you have this disproportionate representation of values and concern in the ear of district attorneys. I think one could correctly assume based off of the lack of engagement in this public office, which is why it's important just to balance it out and make sure our values are pro-civil liberties, pro-civil rights values are being also reflected in that office. I do want to.
Good point.
What was that?
I said I think that's a good point.
And I do want to recognize that we are actually, just turned to 5:01. So totally understand if folks want to go ahead and hop off. We do have a couple more questions here that I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes if you are just to answer. But again, to respect everybody's time, we are at 5 o'clock. And we'll be sure to send follow-ups, and I will send in the chat here the best way to get a hold of us. And I encourage people to not forget about thinking about hosting a ballot party. These are really, really, really great ways to increase voter turnout and to help educate your friends. Okay, so.
I just want to say something, those ballot parties can be done virtually too, so.
Thank you, boss. Virtual ballot parties. And we will definitely be doing only virtual ballot parties, the ones that we are hosting, so. Okay, so another question that I think is interesting is which court or conduct regulatory oversight is in charge of disciplining DAs? And would that be the Attorney General, Jess?
There is an actual office, I want to say, under the Colorado Supreme Court that looks at those very issues. Let me pull it up here. I think it's like the Office of Attorney kind of Regulation. Because they are attorneys and they are licensed to practice. And so, yeah, the attorney regulation, and there's a council for that, really helps the Colorado Supreme Court regulate the practice of law. They oversee attorney administrations, admissions, of course, their continuing education, CLEs, diversion, discipline, unauthorized practice of law, and kind of run the gamut. So I'd say if you have any interest about like what that might look like as attorneys, that would be a good place to start. And I can throw their website into the chat.
Awesome. And there's just a couple more here. One is talking about precedent, like shouldn't district attorneys be following legal precedent and bail? Here it is. Most legal decisions are based on statutes and legal precedent. So why can't DAs follow precedents for plea bargains, bail, etc.? And Jess, I feel like you would have better expertise in this, but my first thought is that the precedents aren't that great to follow because they're following, again, this insular criminal legal culture where the precedent is let's get as many plea bargains as possible as let's get as many cases closed as possible.
I mean, yeah, I guess like I would be declined to really answer that because, we're not attorneys, but I think like what we are suggesting in this webinar is a cultural shift from, throwing folks into cages and throwing away the key to more of a space where we want people to get better. We want people to turn their life around. And so, yeah, again, I would be declined to go into any legal sense because, we're both not attorneys, but I think what we really want to show is that the community wants something different. And that's a cultural shift. And how do we get to that cultural shift where we tell our DAs we want something different?
Yeah, I love that. It's more about making sure they're representing constituents than crystal balling what's in their mind. And then this last one is about USPS. So we're shifting gears just into general voter information, which is of course important. Is the ACLU involved in any suits against the USPS sending out misinformation to Colorado voters? I could take this one. We didn't need to be directly involved in that. And so we weren't. And the reason for that is because our Secretary of State acted quickly on her own, extremely quickly. And just so everyone knows, I'll use this opportunity. The Colorado, we have one of the best we have the best voting system in the country. And we have a longstanding culture of being proud of this system. Again, the system that overhauled how we vote in Colorado was implemented. It was from a bill that was passed in 2013 and implemented in 2014. So that bill was bipartisan supported. Colorado voters are extremely satisfied with the way they vote. And I say that again, that in Colorado, we have a lot to be proud for. And we, unlike the divisiveness of the other countries, tell your friends and family, we get to be proactive and proud of how expansive our voting rights are. Okay, I think that does it for all of our questions. Thanks for those who stuck around. We will send our follow-up materials and always feel welcome to reach out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.